Hello everyone. For today's video, we're going to talk about clay, and specifically the type of clay that you use to make pottery. Last week, I was on vacation celebrating my 20th wedding anniversary, and the place that we went to celebrate was a folk school in North Carolina called the John C. Campbell Folk School. They've been around 90 years, and they teach a very wide variety of folk art and folk craft classes. It's kind of like a camp for grown-ups. Awesome place. So the class I took was creating pottery out of clay. But instead of throwing the clay or spinning it on the wheel like you would traditionally think pottery is made, we made pottery by squishing the clay out into slabs, putting patterns and designs into the clay, and then cutting that clay up according to some templates, putting the pieces together like a puzzle to make pottery. So I want to show you some of the different stages that clay goes through as you work with it. And so I'm going to start with what's over here in this bag. This is as close as I have to how the clay starts out, and it's in this bag to keep it from drying out completely, although it's already dried out quite a lot. These are just some kind of rounded shapes that I made with some of the clay that I had left over near the end of the class. It's not really anything specific, but I think you can tell in the camera the change of color from here to here. And when the clay is soft and pliable, it is much closer to this color here, kind of a gray color, because it has still a very high moisture content. And you could tell now, even though it's holds its shape fairly well, I could go in with my fingernail and scratch into it. And if I put this in water, even just a little bit, like spray a mist of water around it, put it in a plastic bag, and did that a few times, I could eventually get this back to being clay that I could rework into another shape, even though it is dried out quite a bit. This is what they call leather hard. It basically keeps its shape. You can hold it and put some pressure on it, but if you really needed to, you could make some changes to it with a knife, carve it down. You could add some water to it in certain spots, kind of reconstitute it back to its pliable state if you needed to. There's a lot of things you can do to pottery when it's in this state. You can make fittings tighter. You can carve in designs, you can put a different color clay over the top, and then you can let that dry. Then you can scratch that clay off and show the color underneath and create a pattern like that. So we started out with clay that was very wet, squishy, kind of like Play-Doh, what you think of as clay. And it took impressions very well. So we had a ton of different things that we used to make impressions. We had little toy tires and stamps from craft kits, and even things like fan belts and the netting that goes over top of oranges, things like that. So with that, you can make all different types of patterns into it. So this represents kind of the first stage of clay. It's this kind of gray color, and it gets about this hard and starts to transition into air-dried clay, which you can see it's starting to get lighter here on this end. So that's why I have this piece that I started out the video with. This has sat out and has not been in a plastic bag and has been allowed to dry completely. Now you can still tell, I can still scratch on it, but it doesn't take it quite as easily. It more just dusts up and flakes off. If I was to drop this edge might break, but this probably would just kind of crack or may not do anything at all. It's pretty thick. It may weather it pretty well. This, if I drop it, it's a much higher likelihood that it would break, and I would have to slowly reconstitute it back using water and take a longer time to do it. But I could still turn this into wet clay again if I wanted to. It would just take quite a bit of time and water to do that. So I created these two pieces. They're very rough. You can tell there's all kinds of scratches and stuff on them. This is just to kind of use some of the clay I had at the very end. I was creating some sort of sculpture, like two hands cupped together. So that is the next state of clay as it dries out. And you have something called a dry box, which is basically a cupboard or an actual box that has a fan attached to it and a heater. And you can turn either the fan on, or you can turn the fan on and the heater. And it basically pulls air through and around the clay and helps it air dry to this state faster, instead of having to just wait for it to happen naturally. But after that is air dried, it's time to get serious about creating a permanent piece of clay that can be used for pottery. And so that is when you do your first firing. You can tell there's some dust on my hands from that clay that I just handled. And firing happens in something called a kiln, and it can be set to several different degrees, different settings of degrees, getting progressively hotter. And you set it in there and you heat it up for 8 hours or longer. And you come out with something that is a little different in its texture and its quality, and different in its color. It's much lighter. And in the case of this clay I was using, it actually is slightly pink. I don't know if you can see that on the camera or not. If I drop this, it would certainly break. And this cannot be reconstituted back into clay easily at all. I think it's pretty much permanently this. I think you may be able to grind it up into dust and do something with it, but I don't think you can get this back into clay form. Again, these are just some tiles that I made with some of the leftover clay. They had a big stamp. You put your pattern down and you put the stamp over top of it, and it cuts it out into a nice square. So it has a different sound. This clay took some of these patterns very well, nice and sharp. This is like a little palm leaf pattern, and this is like a vines and flowers and leaves. So this is called bisque firing, and the temperatures these fired at was cone 6. And basically what happens is they have little pieces of clay that are pointed on the end, kind of like a cone. And the clay is formulated to melt or bend at a certain temperature. So you can either visually, there's a little like porthole in the kiln, you can view and see the different cones, and you can tell when it's melted, you know you've reached the temperature. Or there's a little device inside the kiln that captures the cone and keeps two contacts apart, and then when the cone melts, the two contacts come together and shuts off the kiln. So there's different levels. The higher the number, the lower the temperature. So you can have like cone 12 is much lower than cone 6, which is much lower than cone 1 or 2. I'm not exactly sure what the exact temperatures are associated with those different measurements. But this was cone 6, and you want to make sure that your clay is rated to that. If you have clay that's rated for cone 3 and you fire it at cone 6, you will actually melt the clay itself and make a big mess. And there's one thing I learned in this class, was that you do not want to make a mess of your kiln. So after you have bisque fired, you have a piece of pottery. But it's very porous. If I poured water onto this, it would soak in. It is not very useful. So in order to make a piece of clay useful, you glaze it. And that means you take the piece of clay and you dip it into different chemicals that are mixed with water, and they coat the outside of your container. This is a mug that I made. This is a red color. I dipped the whole mug, outside of the mug, in red. I dipped the inside of the mug in white first, and then I dipped the very top in a blue color. And so the blue and the red mixed together. And when you're dipping it in, it is like a very thick, chalky substance that soaks into the clay and sits up on top of it. And it does not look like this at all. This was kind of a grayish pink color, and this was just a gray color. It is not until they are fired that the water evaporates out and the chemicals inside of that suspension melt. That brings out their color. They mix together if they're layered on top of each other. And they form this glass-like smooth glaze on the outside of the pottery. It's really amazing because you're never quite sure what the combination is going to look like and how it's going to interact on the piece of clay. So opening up the kiln is kind of like Christmas. It's very exciting, surprisingly exciting. I was very eager to see what my pieces look like. So, and because it is melting basically chemical glass type substance, it tends to want to run down the side of the pitcher, so you'll see how this is mixed in some spots, and some runs more than others. So we leave a gap at the bottom of the piece so that the glaze does not run all the way down off the piece, make contact with the shelf, and then fuse your piece of pottery to the shelf. Because usually the only way you get that up is by chipping away, and you usually chip away your pot. So we were very careful, and we did a good job as a class, and we did not ruin the kiln shelf. So that was good. So one of those things you never really know about until you actually take the class. So we put wax all around the bottom, so when we dipped it in the glaze, the wax resisted. So this is a mug I made. Put 3 feet on the bottom of it. Another piece that I made was this tray. Same process. It started out as a piece of clay that was rolled out to this thickness. I put a mat that had this pattern on it over top of it and rolled it, pressing the pattern into the clay. Then we took and put the piece of square clay on a sponge, and we put a piece of wood and pressed down, and that flattened out the bottom and folded up the sides of the tray. Because it's still very pliable, I was able to push in and make these sides wavy instead of flat. Then I took 2 rolls of clay, turned them into circles, and pressed them into the wet clay. You can tell again, we did not want the glaze to get onto the shelf, so I put wax all around the bottom so I could wipe the glaze off easily and it would not stick to the shelf. This one I just did solid white. You can tell I had to dip half of it, or more than half of it, into the glaze and then dip the other half in. You have a little overlap here of white. So the other piece that I made, we're getting slightly bigger. Let me zoom out some more. This is called a baker. It is a oval. It is an oval piece of cookware. It's pretty oval. This edge kind of bulges out a little bit more than I would like. But I really like the way this turned out. I hope you can see the pattern here. These overlapping circles. And then I use that same pattern here on the handle. I just used the center. And it started out as one long, thin strip of clay, which then I stood up on end and wrapped around and bonded the two ends together. And then I set that on a flat piece of clay, trimmed around it, and I put a roll of clay on the outside and a roll of clay on the inside to hold the two pieces together. Let it dry, bisque fired it, dipped it in blue, which again looked very gray. And I also dipped the edge in a kind of brown. You can tell it has a nice sound to it. And again, we did not do the bottom. But this is food safe. I could bake in this, just as I could drink out of this mug, and it would be fine. And there's one more piece that I glazed. Let me get that for you. This is a big old pitcher. I don't know if I can fit it all on the screen. It is to hold water or milk or whatever you want. And it is triangular in shape. Made on the same principle. I cut out 3 shapes like this, bonded them together on the edge to make kind of a pyramid, placed it on a flat piece of clay for the bottom and trimmed it out. I formed a spout by hand, cut out the corner and molded it on. Then I rolled out a flat piece, formed a handle, and this I had to prop up while it dried to keep this shape. Then I dipped it in green and the spout in blue, so you can see it ran a little bit here. It's a little thicker here. This one is a little more uniform. So this was quite a lot of fun. I had not really worked that much with this type of pottery, and certainly had not done any kind of glazing or bisque firing or anything like that. So it was a very relaxing vacation. We were there for a week and had good food, and I got to take something home and remember my vacation by, other than just photographs or souvenirs that I bought at a store or something like that. Although that's fine, and I do that and I did that, but this is something a little bit more special than that. So I have something practical that I can use. I can pour water from a pitcher into my glass, my cup, and use it. And think about what a fun time I had. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been relaxing. It's in kind of a ramble, talking kind of video, but I wanted to share with you what I've been doing. And please subscribe to my channel. I think I will be doing a food challenge on my next channel, and I have a little hint of what it will be. So this came with the food that I bought and I'm going to try. And it makes a really nice crinkly sound. So, if you think you know what my next food is going to be, leave it in the comments. Well, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you later.